would like to welcome you all to this seminar entitled France and Europe, A Story of Reason Rather Than Love. And I will start with a short introduction to the seminar and today's topic before I give the floor to today's invited speaker, Professor Lequesne. First of all, I would like to inform you that this seminar is part of a seminar series that we have on different issues related to European integration and European affairs, which is funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And for your information, all these seminars are also streamed online, so I hope that you are okay with that. A few weeks ago, we had a seminar about Euroscepticism with Mark Leonard. In January, we will have a seminar with Baldur Thoraldsson from University of Iceland, who will talk about small states in Europe. This seminar series is also linked to a new research project at NUPI entitled European Transition, Small States and Europe in an Age of Global Shifts. And it's funded by the Norwegian Research Council. In this particular project, we focus on the role of small states and how these states balance between integration and autonomy in the EU. And naturally, we have a special focus on Norway and the EU. And while Norway is not an EU member, it is still, as you all know, highly integrated into and therefore also highly influenced by the EU. So the question about autonomy and integration is also very relevant for Norway. But today we are focusing on France and the EU. And France is, of course, not a small state. That would be an exaggeration and also even an insult to the French. But it is interesting that we have been witnessing a less dominant France in Europe over the past years. France has, of course, always, together with Germany, been the natural leader of the European integration process. But this is not that obvious any longer, as far as we see it from the outside. On almost all pressing recent matters within the EU, France has not been in the front seat, and some would argue even counterproductive. Let me just mention Euro crisis and the budget politics. Here we note that the French-German axis is put under considerable stress. Some even say that Poland has become more important for Germany than France. And the same goes for France's role in EU's foreign policy concerning the dispute over the temporary reluctance to give up the sale of Mistral ships to Russia. And France has also been less eager to develop Europe de la Défense or Europe Puissance, which was an important pillar for the French European policy for so long. And on top of all this, French domestic politics is also changing. The economy is not performing well. Hollande is increasingly unpopular, and Front National is gaining considerable support. However, while France seems to have taken a somewhat more passive role in Europe, it is taking a greater international responsibility. We have recently seen an active and even interventionist French foreign policy, and interestingly also often in close alliance with the US. In Africa, let me just mention Chad, Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, and also in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. And this is also interesting, given the fact that France called for more restrictive measures under the Iraq war only 10, 11 years ago. So it seems to me that there is a certain mismatch between the French increasing activism outside of Europe and the far more passive role that France has adopted within the EU. At least this seems to be the case under Hollande. Many of us who have been studying France and French foreign policy for some time have always been struck by the continuity and predictability in French foreign policy. But with these recent changes, this is not that obvious any longer. And I really look forward to this seminar and to learn more about some of the reasons behind this change. This is a correct observation, of course. And to help us better understand the French role in a changing Europe, we are very fortunate to have Professor Christian Lequesne from Centre d'études de recherche internationale, CERI, in Paris. And the title that he has chosen for this seminar also indicates that there has indeed been a change, perhaps away from a more passionate to a more pragmatic approach to Europe. I really look forward to hear more about this. Lequesne is a well-recognized French academic. He has been at CERI since 1988 and the director of the same center from 2006 to 2008. But he has also spent part of his career abroad. From 2004 to 2006, he was director of Centre français de recherche en sciences sociales, CEFR, in Prague. And from 2006 to 2008, he was LSE Sciences Po Alliance Professor at the European Institute of London School of Economics. Lequesne has written several books about French foreign policy in general, and in particular about France and European integration, both in English and in French. And his latest book about François Hollande's foreign policy was published in July this year. I'll also know that he is currently working on a new book about the sociology of French diplomacy. So this means that he is very well placed to give us an interesting analysis of the French policy towards Europe. So with no further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Lequesne. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have first to switch off this little machine. Thank you very much, Dr. Ricker, for this kind and warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you this morning in Oslo, and it's a real pleasure to speak in the building of NUPI, reading very often what you're producing. So thank you to the director, Dr. Ulf Restrup, for his invitation. And it's also a pleasure to see some of my friends here that I met in other places in Europe and who are with us. Before I'm starting to talk about the current situation of France-EU politics, I think it's very useful to remind you some fundamentals that we shall never forget when we are thinking about this topic. First of all, as in many EU member states, I think French preferences on the European integration process have been historically driven by elites rather than society. And when we're talking about French elites, we have to consider that I'm not sure it's not changing. Probably it's changing, but because of the strong tradition of the state, dominant French elite were political and administrative elites, okay? And that has been probably reinforced under the Fifth Republic, because the way to go to the political career was to be first a member of the high civil service, okay? Some colleagues spoke about une fonctionnalisation de la politique in French, okay? Which is very different from some other states in Europe. And when you are considering this, dominant French elite, I think vis-à-vis the European integration, we don't have to consider only, interest, but also beliefs about what France should or should not be in Europe. And there's an excellent book published 10 years ago by an American colleague, Craig Parsons, called A Certain Idea of Europe, that was published by Cornell University Press, which is probably the best account of the beliefs of the French elite vis-à-vis the European integration, which are, again, recurrent fundamentals. So there are three of them. First, EU must have a core composed of big member states. So don't ask me what is a big and what is a small member state, but this is a construct, of course, this is a representation. But this representation is expressed like this: a core composed of big member states exercising a form of leadership, okay? And here you have the, of course, the explanation of the importance of the relationships with Germany, okay, the Franco-German relationship. Second belief, EU must not be limited to a single market, but be a political project with a foreign and security policy. And this is something you will find regularly in the political discourse. We shall be more than a single market. We shall not limit EU to une zone de libre-échange, as former President Giscard d'Estaing would say, okay? And you see also the connection here with enlargement and the sometimes fear that enlargement is going to dilute the EU into a single market and nothing more. Third, France is and has always been very much in favor of an hybrid institutional model, which means a combination of supranational and intergovernmental institutions. Okay, if you are taking well, economic matters, the support of the French government have been, well, supranational method. But if you take foreign and security policy, it has always been an intergovernmental choice, okay? And we know now, because some started to discover the archives, that the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the pillar structure was a French proposal, and especially Pillar 2 for the common foreign and security policy. So that has been the fundamentals. Probably in the history of the relationships between France and the EU, 1989 represents a change, and probably a dramatic change in the course of the French EU politics. Why? First point, the relationship with to be co-leaders for 1980 asymmetry between the two countries, okay? And a complementary asymmetry between, well, the German economic power and the French political power. Of course, then, with the reunification of Germany, questions arrive. What about this asymmetry? Are we going to have this unbalanced balance? Well, again, between Berlin and Paris that we had before between Bonn and Paris. Second question after 1989, the question of the fast enlargement. It's true that the French were not the more supportive actors towards enlargement, for enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe. I have written a book about that in 2000 and 2008. But what is interesting is that when you see the arguments of the reluctance, it was not so much against the Central and Eastern European countries, but it was against this idea that maybe it can go well, against this idea of a political Europe, okay? Which is sometimes called in Paris l'Europe puissance. And it's very difficult to translate it into other languages. If you power Europe doesn't mean, and if you translate it into German, Macht Europa, which is just terrible. So enlargement was considered as a new dimension, of course inevitable, but difficult for the traditional conceptions of the EU in France. And third, probably a fear about, and linked to enlargement, a diffusion of the neoliberal paradigm, so a EU which will be too much market-driven, again, against this idea of a political Europe, okay? Treaty of Maastricht was a sort of compromise, compromise also with the Germans, of course. But what is interesting, and I think it's not a specificity of France, it has been like this in many member states, with the Treaty of Maastricht, 1992, well, Europe does not remain only a question for elites. We had a sort of politicization of the EU debate in France, and that has been the end of what Ronald Hingelart called the permissive consensus. Well, I don't know if this permissive consensus really existed, because if you take the debate 1952, 1954, and the European defense community, it was not really a permissive consensus in France. Okay, so historians can probably contest this idea of a permissive consensus. But it's true that with Maastricht and after Maastricht, society, political parties become more concerned. Europe becomes, for instance, a topic for party competition and also for party splits. If you take the Socialist Party, well, Europe is a real problem for the cohesion of this party. Okay? You get, after Maastricht, more institutionalized Euroscepticism, left and right, with some evolutions in the nature of this Euroscepticism. If you have a look on the arguments which were exchanged in 1992, when President Mitterrand this time decided to have a referendum to ratify the Maastricht Treaty, well, arguments were very much around protection of formal national sovereignty. Okay, what about the impact of an independent central bank on our national sovereignty, etc.? When you take the debate in 2005, where the referendum on the constitutional treaty, asked by President Chirac, led to a negative result, 54% of no. Maastricht was a yes, but a small yes, 51%. It's a different kind of debate. Here, it's really the protection of the welfare state against economic liberalization. Okay. Of course, we can see, as it has been said by Dr. Ricker, an increase of the far-right populists, but this is a trend in many EU member states and also non-EU member states, I think. It's true that at the last European election 2014, the National Front was, well, the first party, 23 seats on 72. And what is interesting is, well, not so much the question of being anti-migrant, anti-establishment, etc., because this is a sort of common denominator of this populist party. But what is interesting is that this National Front is also very much pro-welfare state. Okay, and I think it's a difference with your Norwegian far-right, which is more well, market or libertarian. This is not at all the case in France. They very much argue that the welfare state, the social policies, etc., have to be defended. So it's a transition for me to talk about economic policies, and of course, when we are talking about Europe and economic policy in a country like France, it's an independent game. There is a tradition of welfare state, and I'm sure Norwegians have no problem to understand what a welfare state is. 55% of the GDP is devoted to public spending, so it's one of the highest rate in Europe. There is no liberal tradition in the sense of neoliberalism among politicians, including the right-wing politicians. Well, we had a little movement like this in the 80s with Alain Madelin and this kind of young people at this time, but it's not representative. Most of the leaders, right and left, are thinking about well, regulated economy, which means well, the labor market is very regulated. Social policies are comfortable. Some are well, successful. If you take family policy, for instance, I mean, this is a real success, especially the way little childhood is taken, you know, into consideration. Health, retirement age, etc. Well, the problem is, of course, the difficulty of the state budget to finance, well, those comfortable social policies, because this country has a public deficit since 1974. Okay, so the last balanced budget was 1973. What about the situation today? Public deficit, 4.2% of the GDP. Just to give you an indication, when President Sarkozy finished in 2011 his terms, it was 5.1%. Okay, so it was more than today. And the public debt is 93.5%. Okay, so you immediately see the connection with the EU requirements, with the EU commitments. We have to add to that the employment rate is 10.4%, but it's 23% for the young people age 25 years old and less. So there is a social dissatisfaction, clearly, and this is a problem for any government, right or left, reinforced by the 2008 crisis, even if the crisis had some limited effect in the financial sector, for instance. The French banking system resisted very well to the financial crisis, if you compare to other member states of the EU. And this is one of the strengths of the French economy, the banking system. So it was more the real economy which was affected by the 2008 crisis than the financial world. So what is then the difficult dilemma for the governing elites? If you are from the right, well, you need to have a discourse on rigor during the elections, okay? And this is what Mr. Sarkozy did in 2012. Well, it's not what he did when he was a president in terms of public policy, but it was his discourse to be re-elected in 2012. And, well, he was not successful. But of course, when you are at power as a right-wing politician, you have difficulty to cut drastically the public spending. Okay, so this is one form of contradiction. If you are a left-wing politician, and this is the case now, well, to win the election, you need to have a discourse on the saving of the welfare state, etc. Okay, but when you are at power, of course, you have an obligation to limit the public spending, right? And this is exactly what is happening to Monsieur Hollande and Mr. Valls. So no ideal solution, right? And it's a difficulty, this question of no ideal situation, because the political culture of this country is very much still focused on ideal situations, okay? There is a 19th century, an historian from the 19th century, but who lived the beginning of the 20th century, called Renouvier, who said, and it's the historian Mona Ozouf who mentioned that recently, en France, tout ce qui n'est pas idéal est misère. And it's not untrue. It's not untrue. Okay. So you see, there is a clash with the political culture, if you are right wing or left wing, because you have to go to compromise. You have to go to compromise. So what is the compromise now, which is chosen by the Valls government? Well, there was an increase of taxes, but it had started with Sarkozy. okay? But there is a continuation of the increase of taxes. So the level of tax is high, and one characteristic is that the distribution among the French is particular, because one family on two is not paying tax in this country, okay? So the tax is supported by 50% of the families only, okay? So you see immediately the reaction of the middle class, okay, and especially the small middle class. Second compromise, well, structural reforms going in the direction of more liberalization. This is the choice of the current socialist government. Labor market, more competition, well, try to have firms with less regulation, so it means better competitiveness, etc. And in parallel, negotiations with Brussels to get new deadlines for the respect of the macroeconomic criteria, okay? The last discourse we got from the Minister for Finance, Mr. Sapin, said that France should be able to respect the 3% target in 2017. But 3 times the deadline was delayed. I have to add this. It's not easy, of course, for this government, because this government, well, has decided to reform and has 2 opposition fronts. Of course, the right wing, which are doing their job because they are in the opposition. And they just say, well, he's not going fast enough, etc. But more difficult probably for the Prime Minister is the opposition coming from his own party and from the left. You know, people who said, well, this is not a socialist policy. This is a liberal policy. Right. So, to a certain extent, I have to say that Mr. Valls is brave, because he has to cope with well, a lot of opposition. You see the difficulty for the French leadership in the EU. Well, the difficulty is, of course, what about the compliance to rules, right? And this is what the Germans said all the time, okay? Well, you reform, okay, guys, but you have to comply the rules. And don't know if you've heard about Mrs. Merkel's last interview in the newspaper Die Welt, but this is what she repeated, okay? And on the other way, you have the French society, which wants, well, to keep the welfare state. Right? So, difficult. So the real question for any politician in this country is how to conform to the EU convergence criteria without abandoning the welfare state. I have to say that France has accepted formally a lot of constraints, because France signed the Stability Pact 1997. Does not mean that France respected it, and one of the first violations was 2003, of course. And France signed in 2012 the Fiscal Compact and the Golden Rule. Okay, so probably no other choice than for the right as for the left when they are in government, than respecting this idea that well, there is no growth if you don't first clean your public finances. So, to a certain extent, the German Sparpolitik doxa has won, right? But if you are a French leader, you have also to say that, well, we shall not forget the welfare, we shall not forget solidarity, etc., etc. And here you understand why France is in a sort of in middle between the north and the south. On one side, well, the French government tried to reduce the public deficits. Of course, it goes not so fast as the Germans want, for instance, but because France is not Germany. So you don't have the same historical background. And on the other way, France tried to develop a discourse saying, well, you know, we have to invest more in Europe. We don't have to forget also the spending side of the economy, and we need to have a certain solidarity with the South. Okay, the southern country, which had, well, dramatic effects, of course, of the 2008 crisis. I don't think politicians, when they are in power, believe that there is a possibility to really reverse this trend and to find a sort of new neo-Keynesian model. Some in the Socialist Party think that, okay? But those from the Socialist Party who are at power, well, they immediately consider that this is not feasible. This is not feasible, okay? So if you want to perform better in Europe, well, it's true that there is no real other possibility than following the German ordoliberalismus model. But of course, you need to balance that with a certain discourse on growth, etc., welfare. And the political costs, well, exist, and they exist at the domestic level, of course. This is the problem of the split inside the Socialist Party. There is 100 members of the parliament, well, who regularly criticize the government. We call them les frondeurs, the rioters, okay? And there is the increase of the statist far right, okay? Because the far right said, well, you know, this is just bullshit. What we need for this country is a new supper state, and we have just to close the borders, and everything will be solved, okay? And this is a discourse which has a certain impact, of course, on the people who are, well, unsecure in the society. I mean, the modest level of the society. So for the future, the question is, are we going to stay with a compromise? Because this is a compromise, okay? Or are we going towards more radicalization? It's not easy to answer this question, because it's true that all the surveys we have, but the election is in 2017, so a lot of things can change, you know, in 2.5 years. But most of the surveys show that Mrs. Le Pen is at the second round of a presidential election. Okay, sometimes with, well, the highest rate I've seen from recent surveys given by my colleague Pascal Perrineau was 32% for Madame Le Pen, but this is high, okay? So for the first time, I have to say, I do not consider just as a theoretical thing that Madame Le Pen could win an election, okay? We have now to take it seriously into account as a possibility. Or if it's not the case, what I hope, then we are going to continue this kind of compromise, but without reforms, well, there's no possibility, of course, to change the society first, and second, to get back what is important for France, a certain leadership inside the EU. But what is also interesting is that when you ask the French about leaving the EU, for instance, well, it's very small, well, it's only 23% of the French who considered in June 2014 that French could do better outside the EU. So majority of the French wants to remain in the EU, okay? And it's different from the Brits. If you take the euro, 70% of the French think that leaving the euro will be a bad decision, right? So we can see that there are, well, objective elements also to say that if the reforms are performed, are successful, the French will probably support the idea that the EU has to continue its work. So what about now, and it's my last point, diplomatic and security fronts, because you mentioned that, Pernille, in your introduction. I said that in institutional terms, the French choice for EU security and foreign and security policy is more intergovernmentalism than supranationalism. That's true, but it's intergovernmentalism with an acceptance of new European institutions, okay? France accepted, for instance, the creation of the European Action Service. No opposition to that in principle, right? 2009, well, there was a big decision on security taken by President Sarkozy, return to the military command of NATO. And at this time, the socialists were against. Well, they were in the opposition. So when you're opposition, you're against, of course. That's democracy. But what is interesting is that when Hollande won the election in 2012, he decided not to revise the decision and to stay in NATO, okay? And the way he proceeded is the following. He asked somebody who was clearly against the return to military command of NATO, former Minister of Foreign Affairs Hubert Védrine, to write a report. And the Védrine report said, well, France has to stay. So it's somebody who was an opponent who reached the conclusion that France has to stay with a certain number of conditions. NATO should not become a political organization. NATO should remain a security organization. NATO has to insist on the transatlantic vocation, okay? So it should not be an organization which is going all over the world to solve, security problem. And third condition, said the Védrine report, France has to push for a parallel common strategy within the EU. How do we explain the French commitment in the common foreign and security policy? That's a good and a difficult question. Probably the best answer to this question is, well, CFSP has always been seen as a maximizer of the national diplomacy, okay? So it has never seen as a substitute to the French national diplomacy, but as a maximizer, right? And the involvement on the military side, and you mention, well, the decision of the French government to be present in many conflicts now in the world, well, that has to do with my, I think, with my current research on politicians and diplomats' representation of what efficient French foreign policy is. An efficient foreign policy for most of the diplomats today and politicians, well, is a diplomacy where sometimes you don't have to hesitate to have a military intervention. Okay? So military intervention is part of the representation of what an efficient diplomacy should be. But of course, you have contradiction both with the domestic scene and with the EU scene. The contradiction with the domestic scene is that you have a regular decline of the defense budget. Even if it's representing still 2% of the GDP, and you don't have a particular support of the society to increase this budget. If you ask the French society, what about increasing the welfare budget or increasing the defense budget? Well, probably a large majority of people said the welfare budget, right? And what is the problem with the EU scene? Well, there is one problem when you consider the French long-term strategy vis-à-vis the defense policy. This is what legitimizes the bilateral relation with London, with the UK. Okay? And now the French, well, realize that it's very difficult to get any new political input from the United Kingdom on any EU policy because of the Brexit debate in this country. So the French, they feel that there is a problem here with the Brits, you know, because when we were thinking about security and defense policy, well, it was immediately the Franco-British relationships, okay? Saint-Malo Agreement, 1998, etc. And it's interesting. You find now some alternative which did not exist 10 years ago. In 2013, a white book on defense and security, and French defense and security was published. And in this white book, Livre Blanc, you had a certain number of scenarios, and one was called Weimar Plus scenario. So because we cannot expect more from the Brits, we have to engage the Germans more, and maybe the Poles. Okay, that could be an alternative, which is something different. And plus, it's because Spain and Italy are also there, right? So it's interesting, and I just mentioned what happened in 1952. Of course, it was 7 years after the end of the war for the European defense community. At this time, well, the French opposed to what they perceive as a military re-engagement of the Germans in Europe. But now you have a discourse in France about more engagement from the Germans in the security field. And I don't really remember which politician, but I think it's a right-wing politician who recently said in a newspaper, you know, the Germans, they are looking at our public deficit, but let's see what they're doing for the security of the world. We should deduce our defense spending from our deficit. You know, it was very funny. I really like it, but it's a point. It's a point. The Germans, okay, they are talking about balance of public finances, but they behave like a big Switzerland. Some would say this is what Mr. Lelouch said, a member of the opposition, and they have to be more engaged. Okay. What about concretely the the engagement? Well, the engagement are not necessarily within the EU security and defense policy as such. Sometimes French decided to go alone. That was the case in Mali 2013. Sometimes in a coalition of the willings. That was the case in Libya with the UK 2011. The airplane operation in Iraq against the Islamic State. And it gives the impression, of course, that for this military operation, that the French become closer from the Americans suddenly. Okay, that's an interesting thing. Which is true. I think the old anti-Americanism, well, is a bit over among the politicians of the two classic parties and among the diplomats. I'm not sure that the Gaullist paradigm, that we don't have to mention our belonging to the West, etc., we are a special case, etc., is valid anymore. So, of course, the question for research is how do we explain it? And I think and we had a conversation yesterday on that. Probably one explanation is that now values have become very important in the way you think the foreign policy. Because in the Gaullist paradigm, you didn't really take care of values. You were very much in the realist perspective of interests, okay? But this time is finished. And the more you have to include values, the more you think to, notions like the West, the Western solidarity, etc., etc., okay? And it's interesting because my feeling is that the French are now thinking about Western solidarity precisely at the moment when the West is declining in the international system. This is the interesting paradox. What about Eastern Europe? Well, I think here it's a good explanation of the role of values. The French were strict on sanctions after the Russian intervention in Crimea. Of course, there is a hot potato. This is the Mistral boat, and it has been mentioned because this contract was signed by, the former President Sarkozy in 2011, at a period where probably we thought that speaking to Putin was the right way to move forward, etc., etc. Don't tell me if France is going to sell it or not, because I'm not sure that our politicians know about that. It's my mind about that is changing every day. Okay, so what is sure is that the French diplomacy also would like to avoid any unuseful provocation vis-à-vis Putin. Okay, for instance, there is no support to Ukrainian membership to NATO. That would be considered as too much, okay. But on the other way, there was no hesitation on the question of sanction. And a limit toward the East is also not to transform the neighborhood policy into a membership policy. So this idea that we see sometimes in Poland, well, Ukraine shall become member of the European Union is not supported in France. And further enlargement in general is not very popular among the population. Only 23% of the French population supports a further referendum of the European Union. And this is the only country in the EU where a referendum will be compulsory if enlargement agreement is signed. Okay, this is an article of the French Constitution, 885. Well, it has been invented for Turkey, of course. and I'm not going to mention the details about that, but that would be applicable for other enlargement as well. So, Middle East, I can observe a strict position on nuclear negotiation with Iran. French were very tough on this question. And probably the French wanted to have the Americans more active in Syria. There is still a French deception about non-intervention of the Americans in Syria in September 2013, okay? And that was a sort of political mistake from the French president, because he was probably convinced that the Americans would go. So he did some speeches and that, and at the end it's Obama who said, no, we'll not go, okay? So this is something interesting, I think. What about this activist style vis-à-vis the EU? Is it a compensation of the decrease of leadership on economic issues because of the growing gap with Germany? It's a good question, I think, for research. Maybe the French are very active on the world scene because this is the way they have today to show their leadership. Okay, and if you analyze, for instance, the very active position of French ambassadors at the Security Council in the United Nations, for instance, UN is very important now. The Security Council is very important for French diplomacy. It goes very much in this direction. To conclude, what can I say? Well, first of all, if you look at this country, it's a good example of Europeanization of a member state, okay? Very difficult now in France to think about or to take position about domestic politics and policies without, well, immediately having the European dimension. On economic issues, it's absolutely clear. It's a two-level game. What you do at home influences directly the EU, and what is decided at the EU influences immediately your domestic policies. So, no choice, okay? You have to play the EU game, right? And this is the title. It's a question of reason rather than a question of love. But of course, if you have no choice, then you have to cope with a certain number of domestic conflicts, of course. There is still a French ambition to be a co-leader in Europe. And being a big member state means something for the French. It means something. Okay? It's an interesting topic for research, I think, what it means feeling small or feeling big, you know. And here Poland is a fantastic case study, because the Poles, they feel big. They are not considered by the others already very big, but they feel big in the EU, okay? So it's a question of representation and also self-perception. We see also, because of the role of the economy now as an attribute of power, that the success in domestic economy, well, is a real condition of your leadership at the international or at the EU level, okay? So there is a discourse in France, and I have to say that I'm also supporting this discourse. If we want to be, again, respected in Brussels, etc., we have to be successful in our economic reforms, right? Activism in diplomatic and security fields, with some problems to find partners on the defense side, okay? Public opinion, well, the public opinion, again, I don't think is against the commitments of France in the EU. The public opinion is not very optimistic for the moment on the question of the future of the French welfare state. That's the questions, of course, which are asked by the French public opinion. What about our welfare state? What about, of course, employment? Okay, that's the main questions. So you see that from all of this, it's absolutely inevitable that you don't have controversies around the EU as a consequence in this country. But I have to say that this country has a long habit to deal with controversies. This is part of the French democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. It was a very interesting lecture. And I'm sure there is a lot of questions. Who will start? Yeah, Tore.
My name is Tore Nederberg. I work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for your very incisive and interesting presentation. A lot of things I could ask about that, but I want to maybe look a little bit further and delving into the Euro debate and what are the alternatives. I mean, there is an economic crisis, but it's clearly connected to the Euro and the monetary union, which has its internal contradictions, of course. And I guess the French position is quite much that we need a political union to back up the monetary union. But then many economists say that that will not be enough, and also it's politically very, very important, very difficult. But what if you don't get this political union and the crisis deteriorates, what options are discussed in France? I know that Giscard just published a new book,
yeah.
Returning to this idea of a new start with an inner core. What has been the resonance to that kind of discussion? Oh, thank you.
Do we take several questions, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
Is there any more questions? No, I think we can start with that, and you can say, yeah.
Okay. First of all, I'm not so sure that there is a crisis of the euro. There is a crisis of the economic governance of the eurozone, which is not exactly the same thing. I mean, the euro as a currency is not going well, very bad. You know, it's more the question of the economic policies, right? What is the French position on that? Well, I think most of the politicians, and I'm not talking about the extremes, of course, extreme left and extreme right, but let's say the UMP as the socialists, they have understood that we have to, well, progress in economic governance, which means fiscal policy. Some would say tax policy, but I'm not sure that it would be very easy. Also for decision-making reasons, because if you want to harmonize tax, you need unanimity. So it's a difficult topic. But having more budgetary and fiscal convergence, etc. Well, I don't think this is something which is very much contested by the people who are at power. Okay. The condition, of course, so it's true that quite a lot of politicians think that this economic governance shall be organized better from an institutional point of view, and are very much in favor of having an institutional Eurocore. Okay, so the Eurozone member being more institutionalized inside the EU 28. And this is exactly what Giscard d'Estaing proposed in his last book. And it's interesting because you've seen the countries which are concerned. So you have the original 6, you have Spain, I'm not sure you have Italy, but you have Finland and Poland. That's it. The question is, if you are doing that, do you have to reform the treaties? Do you need to have a formal reform of the treaty? And this is the limit, because I don't think any politician in France currently, and not the President of the Republic, because his support is not extremely high, is going to take the risk of reforming formally the treaties under the formal provision of the treaty, Article 48, I think. So most of the people who are in favor of improving the economic governance have said, well, okay, but with the same treaties, okay? Because nobody wants to risk a new referendum. And if you're a president of the Republic and you have a negative referendum, it's finished for you. This is the tradition of the Fifth Republic. It was a problem of Chirac. He was totally delegitimized in 2005 and was not able to do anything left until 2007. It's finished. It's finished. So Hollande is not going to take this risk. And I don't think if Sarkozy is elected, or if Sarkozy was there, he would have taken this risk. So this is a difference probably with the Germans, because in Germany you have this idea, and it comes regularly in what the CDU said, sometimes even the statements by Mrs. Merkel, that a reform of the treaty will be a right way to settle the economic governance, what they call Krönungstheorie. Okay, the theory that you need a crown around, an institutional crown, and I don't think it's acceptable for the French. So it's a contradiction, because on one way, yes, we need more economic governance, we have to institutionalize the inner core, but no reform of the treaties. That's the situation. It is.
Okay, we have another question. Tove Gravdal.
Yeah, I'm a journalist at Morgenbladet. Hollande went on a surprise visit to Moscow last week. Mm-hmm. Can you, you don't know his motives probably, I mean, we don't read his mind, but can you speculate about his motives for doing that? Is it in competition with Angela Merkel, or is it in accordance with Angela Merkel, or what was the reason for him to go and try to sort of build a better relationship with Putin?
First of all, when you're talking about French and German diplomacy, you know, competition and cooperations are going together all the time. You know, it's a dialectic. It's a dialectic. It's relatively obvious that Germany is playing on behalf of the West an important role in the crisis with Russia for the moment, okay? And the Russians consider that, well, Germany is the country which counts, okay? Because this is the way Russian diplomacy is also perceiving. If you want to discuss compromises, you need partners at the same level than us, so the big partners, Germans, okay? But some change happened in the German politics vis-à-vis Russia, because the Russians knew that the Great Coalition meant for them having the SPD as an ally to a certain extent, because the SPD has this tradition of Ostpolitics, etc., and didn't want to be too aggressive vis-à-vis Moscow. Situation is changing among the SPD. There is a debate among the German SPD. And in particular, Franz-Walter Steinmeier is becoming much more skeptical than he was probably 1 year ago vis-à-vis Putin. So for the German, it's a problem. So I will not be astonished that the German try to have a contact with the French, okay, to give the impression to the Germans now that, well, they can speak to others as well. You know what I mean? And it goes very well with this idea that the best way to deal with the EU is to divide the capitals. Okay, this is something that the Russian diplomacy knows very well. They know how to do that. So I'm not sure that the explanation of this visit has to be found in priority in Paris. It's maybe in Moscow, okay? And if you are the president of France, and you have the impression that the Germans really play a big game on that, but we give you the opportunity to show that you can also play a big game, well, you don't hesitate. You go and you discuss, okay? So that's my explanation of the recent visit.
Okay, and just add a question myself. It was interesting that you said that now there is a focus on values, that values has become more important in French foreign policy. But it's difficult to interpret this kind of international activism, this interventionist kind of approach, only based on values. And it could very well be kind of, as you said, also kind of as a substitute for a weaker position in Europe. And it's important for France. That goes very well with also the Gaullist tradition. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder, in relation to French commitment to Europe, you say that the population are still very much in favor of staying in the EU, of course, if they are asked about that. But what about the commitment on among the political leadership? Because we have seen, as I said in the introduction also, that France has been less in the front seat in these big debates, at least under Hollande. A little bit more under Sarkozy, because he had a lot of initiatives about the Euro-Mediterranean Union and these things. So I just wonder if it's really true that you have this shift towards values, and if the commitment to Europe is still there in the political leadership.
Okay. Maybe I have to be a bit more precise about my value argument. What I wanted to say is that the French diplomacy cannot escape now the what I will call the Western liberal agenda. Okay? If you are a French diplomat, well, human rights, respect of sovereignty, etc. This is something which you have to take into consideration in your decision, right? No choice, no choice. But it does not mean that you renounce to interests. You can do both. You can do both. Okay, so this is now the constraint of the French. They cannot just say, well, you know, we're doing a policy just on behalf of our interest. It's finished. It's not working anymore. Some said we should do that. This is what Hubert Védrine said, for instance, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's a good friend of mine, but I totally disagree with him, because I think it's and I like discussing with him, but it's not possible anymore. You have to be in accordance with this Western liberal normative agenda as well. Okay? Political leadership, of course, what the French population is probably seeing is the rise of Germany, and they have the impression that the French leadership is decreasing among the EU. Okay, you can see that in the press all the time, and some would say, well, you know, it's finished now. It's the German who are the leaders. They are the de facto leaders. Okay, and others would say, well, if you want to be again co-leader with them, we have to reform our economy, because this is the only way to be a leader in Europe. Okay, this is the debate. But you're right. Sarkozy understood that doing some, can I say that? I would say in French, agitation. I don't know what's the word.
Agitate.
Yes. Was also very important in terms of perceptions by the French population of the French leadership inside the EU. And when he went to Georgia 2008 or to Russia to get the ceasefire, the way he behaved in the economic crisis, etc., was very much appreciated by the population. But this is the transfer to the EU of what the French are expecting from their president at home. I think it's a country where providential man still, is still expected by the electorate. I'm not sure it's very much in connection with modernity. I'm very much against this idea that we need providential man. But it's part of the political culture, I think. Okay? So Hollande is I'm not sure he's doing less than Sarkozy, but is not playing this card of,
bling bling
image. No, well, I don't want to say bling bling, but this image of being very active there, right? You know, the man who is at the crosswords of everything, etc. But when you play this game, I have to say that you get a certain legitimacy among the population. That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, Ulf?
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. 2 questions. The first is you started off saying, or you concluded say there is no escape somehow from this Europeanized France, and you mentioned this 2-level game, but at the same time you were not too optimistic that the French would be able to make the reforms, sufficient reforms to recover and to make sure that you have economic development. So in some sense, what I take away from your story is that it's somehow inevitable that National Front will be very strong. And you mentioned even that it's quite likely that it's not, we cannot rule out that she could become president. So I just wonder, if she becomes the president, would that change this the structural linkage to Europe? So that's the first question. Will she be able to get out of this trap, and how to do that? So that's the first question. The other question is, you covered a lot of things in your presentation, but one thing that you did not mention, and that's France's relationship to Asia and to China. Because you said, what I take away from your presentation is that France is still very much a European power, and it's orienting itself very much in Europe and looking in its neighborhood, because it doesn't succeed that well in economics in Europe. But so what kind of role for this more morally value-oriented Western France, Western liberal France, what kind of role is it playing in relation to, for instance, China?
Okay. First of all, you got the impression from my presentation that French will not do the reform. This is not exactly what I think. I think the reform will take time, but the trend and the process will be a reformist one. It does not mean that the National Front is not going to get gains in the short terms. Of course, in the short terms, they will win more support because of the reformist agenda. But I do not see any possibility to escape this reformist agenda, except if the National Front won the election. But I try not to think too much about that. And I have to say that I am optimistic when I see what probably the younger generation is prepared to accept vis-à-vis my generation, and even more the generation of my parents. I think the younger generation is very realistic about the reform of the welfare state, and they know that, well, the world, of course, is a globalized world, that independence exists, etc., etc. Okay? But they also know that they will not, well, get their retirement with 60 years old and 80% of their former salary. They know about that, okay? So on the long term, I'm convinced that this society is going to reform itself, okay? And I very much trust in the change of generation also. China. Well, France is doing business with China, as most of the EU member states, but politically speaking, Asia is not a big priority on the agenda of the French. But this is true for the Europeans in general. I mean, when you take the security issues, well, it's very much a questions which is left to the Americans. So French is selling. Maybe your points was about well, selling weapons, no? Because this is it's true that the French are selling weapons, and they are not very much in favor of a weapon embargo as other countries. But we know selling weapons, Germans are selling weapons, Brits are selling weapons, you know. Everybody's selling weapons because you get a lot of cash when you sell weapons. So it's a very good business. So it's true that sometimes the Western liberal agenda, when we are considering this question of weapons, is, well, is second order. But for the rest, I don't think there is a and this is something which is very much stressed by people who are working in Asia. There is no strategic thinking about Asia in France, and I'm afraid this is a more general European problem.
Sorry, I think it was not clear on my question, but I think my question relates to what kind of world do the French elites see emerging? What kind of role do they see? What kind of you mentioned the importance of the UN and Security Council. Others will say that some of these institutions, we are facing a new world order. And what kind of role do they see for Europe in this world order? What kind of what kind of role do they see for Asia? What kind of ties should Europe develop to Asian countries, etc.? That was my mind. So it's not the weapon export part, but that's an element.
Well, probably, as again, I'm sure it's a French specificity. As most of the Europeans, there is a view of the increase of the non-Western world, including China. Okay, and that we have to cope with that, with this reality. And you can see some process of adaptation of the elites to that. It's interesting when you take now the upper class. I'm not talking about middle class, but about the upper class. There is a new discourse about, well, you know, kids have to learn Mandarin as a second language because that could be very useful, you know, for the future. It's not bad to take a year in Shanghai or in Beijing rather than in London, etc., etc. So, but this is something which is probably characterizing all the European elites today. This kind of adaptative process. What is interesting in the case of France is that we have the impression that this country is very anti-globalization, because there is a certain political discourse against globalization, but when you take the practices of the elites in this country, what a fantastic adaptation to globalization. It's, you know, the new trend now is to put your kids not at Sciences Po anymore, but you send them in Cornell as undergraduate, or you send them to LSE, or so this is well, meaning something. This is meaning something, and it could have, at the end, it could have a certain impact on. We have absolutely no studies on that, but it could have an impact on the way elites are recruiting in the country, because what we see is that those young kids who have American PhD or British PhD, etc., they are working for well, international companies, international organizations, but not necessarily for the French state anymore. Okay, and it was not like that 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, well, you sent your kid at Sciences Po, and when the kid entered the ENA and becomes an inspecteur des finances, you were very happy. Okay, those things are changing. So, and I really consider that that the French elites are very well adapted to globalization, and economic elites as well. If you take the big business, French big business is a fantastic example of adaptation to globalization. Look at what L'Oréal, Veolia, Total is doing all around the world.
Yeah, Nils Morten Ødegaard first, and then.
I'm Nils Ødegaard, a foreign policy commentator. I would like to follow up the question and ask you to try to outline for us what is likely to happen if Le Pen wins the election. And then my second question is, do you see any similarities between Front National and the new German Alternative für Deutschland and the movement we have on the right in German politics on anti-EU or critical groups to the right?
You can take the last question at the same time, maybe.
Well, I just wanted to add
the microphone.
I just wanted to add a question to the relationship between France and China. And has there been any reaction? Well, I'd like to know the reactions among the politicians, right and left, and to the public in general about the sale of next to 50% of Toulouse Airport to the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Well, what happened if Le Pen win the election? First of all, I am asking the status of political refugee in Norway. That's my first question, my first answer to your question. Second, well, I don't think she's going to vote, even if she's going to win, even if what is going on inside the two other parties, I mean the classic parties, Parti Socialiste on one side and UMP, is very much in favor of Madame Le Pen, especially the UMP, because, well, we have the impression that Sarkozy is coming back. We're going to have a primary, for the first time, a primary election inside the UMP party. But if Sarkozy is the candidate of the UMP, and then we have a second round, Le Pen versus Sarkozy, it will not be easy for the left-wing voters to vote for Sarkozy, when it would be probably easier to vote for somebody like Alain Juppé. So this is something I think the right has to take into consideration. If she wins, probably, and again, it's in theory, she'll be president of the republic, but she will not have a majority in the National Assembly because of the electoral system. So we'll have a cohabitation between Madame Le Pen at the Élysée Palace and a majority, probably a classic right-wing majority at the National Assembly. This is exactly what the people who are very close for Madame Le Pen would like to see, because all the strategy of those people now is to give the impression that a normalization impression, you know, that the Front National is a normal right-wing party. And it's very interesting to see how she, well, she's doing it in a subtle way, how she tries as much as she can to cut the heritage of her father, you know, to see, well, we are the new right, you know. First of all, we are the real right, because the other ones are not right-wing. We are the real right. But we will to play the game of the institutions, blah, 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 blah. And the people who have the power inside the Front National, close from Madame Le Pen, this is exactly the strategy they are advising her. Okay? So a cohabitation, and I don't know how it could work, but it's probably, from a constitutional point of view, the only solution. Front National and AfD. Well, I'm not impression that we can compare both movements, because I'm not sure AfD is a far right party. AfD gives me the impression of being very much structured around the question of the euro. And this is all this German economists who already were active during the Maastricht Treaty, who said, well, you know, euro is a bad idea. We cannot manage that because we don't have a political federation in Europe, etc., etc. But I don't have the impression that they are so much anti-establishment. Some would say that they now try to play the game also of well, limiting migration, etc., and what happened in the Länder recently, where they won. I know that they were Thüringen, I don't know which Länder, but two or three Länders where they did well. Some would say, well, you know, they're going now to this direction also of anti-migration discourse, etc. But I don't think it's really comparable for the moment. I will not compare them. And I don't think AfD would accept to be in the same political group, for instance, than the Front National in the European Parliament. Probably not. They would resist to that. Toulouse Airport, yes, you know that the Chinese, they have only 30% of the, well, they invested 30% of the capital, but most of the capital remains national capital. So, of course, there were some discussions inside in the press, but after 2 days it was finished. And Manuel Valls, the Prime Minister, was invited last Sunday at the French TV, and he explained that very well. He said, you know, but this is now the consequence of globalization, and they don't have the majority of the share, etc., etc. So, and I don't have the impression that it's a subject which will be very much confronted to French identity, etc. Not so much.
I think we have to end there. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas about France and Europe.
My pleasure.
It's very interesting, and thank you also for very good questions.
Thank you for your
So thank you.